Hello and welcome to the Path 11 podcast with your hosts, Mike and April. April is off again this week, but she'll be back next week when we talk to Robert Wagner. This week is part 2 of our conversation with Graham Nicholls. If you want to know more about Graham, please check the show notes for related links and information. You do offer OBE coaching through your website?
Yes, I teach one-to-one through tuition, which is available through Skype. So I do that all over the world. And I also run a course, a 5-week course, an online course called the Navigator course that's also on my website. So yeah, they're the main, and occasionally I do workshops as well, select workshops in different parts of the world, usually in the UK, but also sometimes in the US, etc. But the courses and the coaching, I think, are the most effective ways to learn because they allow for more time for you to actually get to grips with the techniques and also the wider process, because I don't just focus on techniques. I look at the person's wider life, the levels of stress, the levels of creativity, the types of things the person likes doing. I try to bring all of those into the mix, into the process for learning, basically.
Okay, yeah. Your book, Navigating the OBE, Radical New Techniques. Is that what you mean by radical, where it's a different approach than to just...
Yeah.
Okay.
That's that whole book is based on that kind of idea. It has the idea of the profile, so you create a profile of the personality type of the individual. So instead of how most people try to fit fit the technique to the person, fit the person to the technique. I take the approach of fitting the person to the technique. So you find through the profile, by looking at the person in depth, what exactly would be the best method for them as an individual. What are their skills? What are their what's their natural attributes as a person, and then use that to select or develop a technique. Then the book also looks at this idea of immersion, using immersive processes to take you deeper, a bit like what I was just mentioning with the idea of shutting off the senses or overwhelming the senses through different practices. Well, that classic approach is really, I call it immersion, and I've been working with immersion for a long time, using different structures, using techniques, using technology like virtual reality and things like that, which we didn't really get into, but I've built high-end virtual reality systems at the Science Museum in the UK and things like that. So my work goes far beyond the literal basics of the out-body experience into scientific research and into technology and things like that as well.
That sounds pretty fascinating. Because right now I'm just using one technique, and it's you wake up in the middle of the night, like 4 a.m., and you go do some work or whatever, you read something, or then an hour or two later you go back to sleep for like another 2 hours. And I've had pretty good success with that, but I've got to really expand my techniques, and I think this book definitely goes far beyond the typical techniques that I've read about in the past.
Thank you.
And I should really pick that up. And do you have like a technique that works the best for you that you would want to share? Or
techniques wise, I just use a very simple process, because I think, like I was alluding to when I mentioned this sort of more holistic approach, I think the most important thing is to have all of the factors in place, like your mental state, your physical state, all of those kinds of things. All of that is more important. So if you get to the point that you are deeply relaxed or deeply in the exhaustion stage, which is another way of getting to the body shutting off, basically. If you're in that kind of state, then going to the full experience is very easy, because the vibrations will come about very easily. I've also got my technology, the Infra-liminal Sound, which helps to bring about the vibrational state. So from there, it's just really about putting your awareness or your attention on a different place or idea or destination. So that's really kind of all I do really. But I think for people learning, it's obviously you need to go through all of those steps, and you need to build that foundation, and you need to understand the mechanisms behind all of the techniques. All of the techniques really have a similar series of steps involved, and I think that's really what you need to sort of understand through the process. The most effective technique for me all the way through was always just doing basically the body of light technique that I mentioned, which is you would just imagine a figure out in front of you and then try to transfer your awareness into that figure. But again, as I mentioned, people are very different. Some people are more lucid dreamers and they're better with the sleep methods and the waking up and going back to sleep type sleep interruption type methods. Other people are better at conscious projection, trance states, altered states. Other people are better with sound technology. There's different things are better for different types of people. So that's really how my teaching and my approach differs from anything else I'm aware of.
So it's almost like building a lifestyle around
Yeah,
the OBE, or choosing a technique that fits your lifestyle in a way. Um,
yeah, yeah.
okay, that's very interesting. And I wanted to talk about the infraliminal as well that you talked about a second ago. Can you go into detail about that? Exactly how that works?
How it works is a bit beyond the scope of what I can explain right now, but it's basically it works on two principles, which is kind of frequencies and the natural rhythm within the frequency. I don't know if you've ever heard a frequency as you turn down a frequency in a consistent way, you get a kind of rhythm that comes out of the descending frequency, basically. So that's one of the key elements of it, is this descending frequency, but then also which basically brings about a sort of light sort of trance state. Then it has infrasound, very very low level sound built in, and then it has subliminals as well. So basically, that's where the name comes from. Infraliminal. It's a combination of infrasound, specific frequency patterns, and subliminal programming. So the combination of those factors all brought together in one technology is basically how it works. It doesn't use any binaural beats or anything like that. It's a totally different thing. Doesn't have any relationship to that other than they're both sound. So that's kind of key as well. But what how it was developed was really using neurofeedback and looking at the type of brain state I would get into when I would go into the vibrational state, and then also trying to cause that kind of effect using different sound effects and things like that. And we kind of started a little bit from, like I was mentioning, with shamanic trance often uses this rhythmic drumming and things like that. But I then started to wonder if you could combine that in a way with frequency to create this frequency rhythm. So that was sort of the early stages that I developed in the late 90s, about 98. And I started using NLP and hypnosis in some of my structures. For example, I made a structure that I call Epicene, which was a large steel frame which had a platform, a kind of bed-like platform suspended in the middle by very, very fine steel wire. So you basically couldn't see it. So when the person would go and lay on that platform, it would feel like they were floating in space, essentially. And then the sound would be triggered. So there would be this combination of sound and hypnotic induction, which would hopefully take them to the vibrational state or to the out of body experience. And through doing those kinds of things, immersing that person in that kind of level of experience, it would start to increase their chances of having the experience. So it wasn't a huge increase. You're talking sort of in the region of 7%, something like that. But if you imagine taking that 7% and then adding that in with changes in diet, for example, that also help the experience, reductions in stress that also help the experience, doing other forms of trance work that also, when you bring all of those factors together, that's really when you go into a huge advantage to have consistent experiences, and that's really how I teach it.
I just wanted to ask you if are you familiar with the they call them the floating tanks. I don't know if that's exactly the correct.
Yes, flotation tanks. Yes, I'm
Yeah.
interested in all forms of sensory deprivation as well. It's another area that I work with sometimes, and I did a lot of research in my early days with looking into this type of area, and I researched a scientist called John Zubek, who did 15 years of research into sensory deprivation, and I learned a lot from looking at the types of work he did and how he found that certain types of sensory deprivation would induce certain types of trance state, certain types of experiences like out-of-body experiences and things like that. So I do, from time to time, use flotation tanks, and also with my own structures and things like that. They're based on the same sort of principle of creating that sense of the senses being shut down so that you can experience the inner core again, as I mentioned.
Yeah, that's something that's been slowly gaining momentum here in the U.S. is those sensory deprivation tanks.
Mm.
I know there's a couple in New York City and California where people just go and they just lose all contact with the outside world, and they just almost like meditating with no sense of your senses basically. And
Yeah, they were popular a few decades ago, but
yeah,
I think people like Joe Rogan have repopularized them in recent years. So it's really good. I think they're an amazing thing, and a great way to introduce ideas like this to a sort of wider public, I think.
yeah, and I think he's even installed them in his house.
Yeah, he has one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and your other book, Avenues of the Human Spirit, do you want
Mm.
to talk about that at all?
Well, Avenues of the Human Spirit is really my personal journey with the out of body experience and beyond. The also the areas like seeing apparitions, shared experiences of seeing a kind of orb energy form and things like that with my close friend when I was a teenager. Other sort of visionary type experiences and things like that. So it really goes into the types of experiences I've had over the years, experiences that seem to be like going into afterlife levels and things like that, seeing people that seem to have just passed over. One experience where I saw a plane crash, for example. Well, I saw the people who seemed to have died in a plane crash, and then discovered after the out-of-body experience that there had actually been a plane crash. So that was actually one of those more subjective experiences, but at the same time, it was one that matched with our sort of consensus reality. So that was very interesting. It was almost like a verification of the afterlife to some degree. So that was an interesting experience, and that's all described in Avenues of the Human Spirit. And then at the end, I bring it all together into what I call a philosophy of benevolence. This idea of basically all of these experiences have led me to a greater sense of feeling interconnection with everything around me, and living a more benevolent life, basing my essential ideas on the golden rule, the idea of do unto others as you would yourself, that core spiritual value that's really been in humanity for forever. So I think that's really the whole journey with the whole thing, and that book explores all of those ideas in a lot more depth. So that's really what it's about.
Now, I just wanted to ask about that plane crash story that you had. Now, it wasn't a future experience. It wasn't a past experience. It was almost like a real time.
It was real time, yeah.
Okay, so it was you were experiencing as they were experiencing.
Yeah,
Okay.
I basically I laid down to do my OBE practice. I hadn't seen the news or anything like that, and I just laid down and I went into the out of body experience. And instead of finding myself in more the physical environment, I found myself in a very misty, very classic afterlife looking environment, very misty, no particular buildings or structures or plants or anything, just this sort of mist. But at a distance, maybe around 150 meters again, actually, like some of the precognitive experiences. But at a distance to me, there was a group of maybe 200 people who looked confused, unsure what had happened. I got the impression that they'd passed over very fast and that they were now all in this sort of in between state and didn't really know what was taking place. And I felt like I wanted to kind of try and comfort them or communicate something to them, but I couldn't reach them. They were at a distance to me. I don't know if that's because I was still alive and I couldn't cross that threshold or something like that. I don't know, but there was a sense of distance, and I sort of wanted to reach out to them, but I couldn't. And then I just felt myself going back sort of through the mistiness and was back in my body. And then that evening, I was just watching the news with my family, and there was a story that there'd been this plane crash and all these people had died, 200 or so people. So that was that seemed to correlate well with that particular experience. I couldn't be totally sure, obviously, but I felt very much that that's what I'd seen in the experience.
Have you noticed that when you become more proficient, and both Tom, when we were filming him, Tom Campbell had mentioned, and even Teal Swan in this podcast a few episodes back, they both said that once you become proficient in becoming out of body, the universe kind of puts you at work. Do you think that maybe putting you in that OBE next to the plane crash, do you think maybe they're like trying to test you to see if you were going to work, um, or have you had other experiences where you've helped people cross over, or maybe help?
Um, I guess there's been I guess my work in general feels like it's related to that kind of thing and related to helping people and healing and those kinds of things in general. I've I guess as well, I've also done like physical activism in trying to help people. So in some senses, I don't just focus on the out of body experience. I back in around 2003 or so, I that was when I really started doing active work in that sense, and I got involved in the Make Poverty History campaign and started an organisation to sort of fight poverty, and was working on those kinds of areas. I've constantly worked with animal rights and promoting human rights and things like that. So I guess a lot of my putting to work in if you like in those contexts has been more in a physical practical sense, but I think by giving people these experiences and reconnecting them with their loved ones and helping them in that process, I think that's really also been a factor of what I do. But I don't, it's a whole spectrum of different areas, I guess, teaching people to have the experience, working with people to sort of make a shift in their life and their reality, and also actually trying to help the people who are really disadvantaged and suffering in this world, because in many ways I came from quite a hard background when I was a child as well, and so I've kind of still got that awareness of people who are surrounded by problems and social issues and things like that. And I want to reach out to that and work with that kind of compassion, really. And I think the animal issue is a huge one as well, because human beings enslave and murder billions of animals for no reason whatsoever and harm their own health at the same time. So I feel that veganism and animal rights is also a huge issue for the environment, for human beings, and for animals.
Now, the next question, I don't know if you want to answer this. It's kind of a big question, and it kind of it's almost like if you've been going out of body, you've talked to. I'm assuming you probably talked to your guides, or maybe you have a different view of that. Um,
I have intelligences or beings or whatever you want to call that I would describe as guides. Yeah, I don't know what they are, but
okay, yeah.
but yeah, I understand what you're asking. Yes.
So, have you asked what this is all about? Is
Um,
like the point of life, I guess.
I I feel the point of life is what you make it, and I feel that if there's a lesson that we need to learn, it's the responsibility to decide and to choose for ourselves what our purpose is. There's no easy explanation. There's no someone going to come and tell you this is what it's all about. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. I think that's the big message. It's interesting when religious people say, "How can you be moral without a religion?" And I think it's almost the opposite. I think that if something has to tell you to be moral, then you don't understand what being moral is. And so I think if you need something to tell you what the purpose of your life is and what the purpose of life is, then you haven't fully understood the value of your life and the essence of it. That's how I feel. I'm not imposing that on anyone else, but if you ask me that question, that's how I feel. I feel that we have to learn to take responsibility and define and explore and make that choice and decision for ourselves. I think we need to embrace diversity. We need to embrace all of the different flavors of humanity and life in general throughout the world. And the more we can do that, the more hate and violence and racism and homophobia and all of these different ideas will diminish, because we will start to see the value in difference. And I think that's what we really need to see more in the world.
That was a great answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like if I could, I'd stand up and give you an applause for that. That was pretty good. That's exactly how I see things, and I wish things would be like that. But I guess, and this is probably one of my last questions: is there a reason why we have this ability to go out of body or remote view? Is it something that was, I don't know, programmed this way, or it's just this is just how I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I don't even know how to ask the question now. The more I think about it, it's kind of like 90% of the population of the globe doesn't go out of body consciously, but we do it, and then there's the bunch of us that can do it consciously. Is there a reason why we have this ability, or
I
were we?
think it's just our nature. I think it's just a part of our reality. It's a part of the world we inhabit, and because we're not just you know we operate in multiple forms in our lives. We have our social life, we have our work life, we have all these different aspects of how we live and how we interact. And I think that, and reality is the same. There is the levels of nature, there's the laws of physics, there's the cosmology, the universe beyond, all the black holes, and the, you know, there's these different aspects of the world that we see and we understand. And I think that on a smaller level, on a sort of microcosm, the out of body experience is like the difference maybe between outer space and the physical, our physical lives. You know, it's sort of, we need to learn to sort of embrace all of it. You mentioned that some people never have an out of body experience and they don't sort of ever focus on that. But I think many people don't even make time to ask the question, what do I really want in my life? Many of us, unfortunately, just go into this process of, I'm going to be educated, and then I'm going to get a job, and then I'm going to get a mortgage and have a family, and then I'm going to basically die. And it's sort of this predetermined sort of route in life. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's no judgment in that. But what I think is, more of us need to take a moment and say, actually, is this really what I want? Maybe what some of those people would actually rather be a hermit out in the woods. Maybe one of those people would rather, become an artist or an activist to help the world. Or, there's so many forms that it could take. And again, that goes back to what I was saying about diversity, embracing diversity. If instead of following the sort of the crowd, the herd, and more of us defined what we really want and who we really want to be, I think then we would be in a much better situation in the world.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And I want to ask you about the events that you do. You have any events coming up, and what are the events that you normally do in like a group setting?
Mostly what I do is the course online and the online coaching. But I do quite a lot of lectures and conferences and things like that. But the next thing that people might be interested in, especially people in the UK, is in around November, I'm going to be doing a joint event, a joint workshop with Anthony Peake. I don't know if you know Anthony Peake's work, but he's an excellent guy doing amazing research and really pushing things forward in terms of understanding what's going on in terms of science and trying to understand these things with as little pre-assumption as possible. I mean, he is someone who's willing to change his mind, and I think that's very, very important. And actually, when he encountered my experiences, he did change his mind about that out of body experiences can be an objective thing. So me and Anthony are going to do a workshop where I will focus on some of the more philosophical and practical sides, and he will talk more about the scientific and the implications of the science, etc. So that's going to be an exciting workshop coming up, and that will be in the UK, and we may even do it in the US at some point as well. So if people want to add me on Facebook or follow me on my website, there's a mailing list. They'll get information when that gets the dates get finalized, etc.
All right. And yeah, we're familiar with Anthony. We haven't talked to him directly yet, but we want to eventually get him on the show. We kind of like where he's going with his work. And yeah, you'll definitely have to keep us posted. Like I said before the show, if you come to the US, look us up, and love to talk to you in person, and maybe do a
That would
live
be great.
podcast.
That
Yeah.
would be great.
And yeah, hopefully one day when we do our world tour, we can go to the UK and talk to you and people like Anthony and
Or Estonia, even.
yeah, Estonia. Yep, that's right. And yeah, that'd be great. And so you mentioned Facebook. You have your website, which we'll put in the show notes, and people can click on them and go right to them. Do you have any other sites? Are you on Twitter or?
I am on Twitter. It's just Graham _Nicholls. That's Nicholls with two L's. And yeah, they're the main ones that I use really. I mean, Facebook's probably the best one to keep up with my workshops and my courses and events, etc.
Okay. Is that a page or is that a group on Facebook?
I have a group, I have a like page, and I have my people can just also friend me if they want, or like me on the like page, and I post everything on both of those places, so they'll
Okay.
find out. And the Navigator course, they can join that at any time because there's pre-recorded as well as live classes, so that's always available as well.
Yeah, I might look into that navigator course. That sounds like something I could probably use to, as I get more advanced. So, yeah, it's something I should look
Okay.
into. um, all right. Yeah. Is there anything you want to talk about that I may have missed?
There is a collaborative book coming out soon where I get more into the evidence side of things. So that's going to be called Consciousness Beyond the Body, and that's a collaborative book with a few different authors are going to be in on that. So that's going to be coming out later this year. So that's going to be free as well. So it's a free ebook for anyone who's interested, basically.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I'll definitely look forward to that. Yeah, well, maybe we'll get you back on, and if the other authors that you're collaborating with, maybe we get the whole group on and have a roundtable discussion about it.
That could be interesting. Yeah, so it's
Okay.
nice to talk about the kind of the wider spiritual implications of it all, I think, as well. So um, I think that's often can get overlooked by the focus on the fact that the experience is quite dramatic and powerful, etc. But it does have that impact on the individual as well, which I think is kind of important. And it tends to get emphasized with near-death experiences, but less so with out of body. And I think they both have that similar effect on people.
Yeah. Yeah, and also too, I know and you kind of mentioned it too that you don't want to talk about the other experiences outside of this physical reality um,
Well,
that are
not too much. I mean, I will
right.
talk about them, but I just I don't want kind of to push that on people too much because I've seen that be a bit detrimental to people sometimes because they expect their experiences to be like, whoever they've read or things like that. And I try to emphasize the experiences are different for different people, depending on what their alignment is and how much other practice they do and things like that, like meditation and things seem to have a quite a profound effect on the quality and the length and depth of the experience, etc.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, because I kind of hit on it a little bit that I'm on a fine line where there's like the younger side of me is like, oh, you got to find out about such and such worlds and beings, and but then the other side's like, yeah, well, you got to be respectful for the newcomer that you don't want to as and Tom had always said, you don't want to direct them to your experience. They want to have their own experience.
Yeah, and I like that about Tom a lot. I mean, I definitely have a lot of respect for that opinion because in many ways talking about all the fantastical stuff is tempting because it's people like it, it's enjoyable, but we've got to remember that we're not, there's a degree of entertainment in what we're doing, but it's far more important than that.
Right.
And it's important to keep the integrity of not not getting caught up in the bells and whistles, if you like, as they would say, and to focus on what the actual core of the experience is. I mean, those subjective levels are amazing, but they do seem to be quite different for different people, and it's a bit like, I guess, different religions. It's very hard to because they're all convinced they're correct, and it's a bit like that with the OBE work. It's like every OBE person's like, oh, my take on it's correct or whatever. And I just think we need to remember, well, no one's correct as such. We're just trying to understand it, but the best way to do that is through you know the objective, or the as much scientific sort of attitude. And what I mean by that is the scientific method, not scientific dogma. I mean, looking at it with, okay, can we find something to support that idea? Is there something beyond just my personal experience? Because I think it's healthy to even question your own experiences. It's very easy to get deluded about things and to lose yourself in things.
I just want to ask you if if you do, especially the one-on-one coaching, or if you're teaching a group, do you take in like your students' experiences? Do you allow yourself to totally get immersed into their experience, but then you're able to keep it, at on the side, saying, "Well, this is their experience. This is not something that I might ever experience." But do you? I don't know if I'm answering that or
I,
asking
I
that right.
guess I guess I have experienced something similar to most of what people describe to me, so I can usually relate it to something. Um, I do occasionally get someone who will describe something that's really nothing like I've experienced, but that's quite rare. I guess my early experiences were more in the realm of, I'd say, in a way, more of the illusionary type aspects were more common in the early experiences, which goes back a bit to when you were asking about does the experience change over time and things like that. Well, the early experiences, when I was often had more of a body in the out of body experience, and the environment around me was more like physical and structured but in a more it was more like a sort of psychological version at some points in the early experiences. But then with meditation, especially Zen meditation, um, I slowly sort of seemed to dissolve that. And what happened was the body and all of that kind of stuff seemed to become less and less important. And then instead of the environment looking sort of dark and structured in a sort of very heavy way, it seemed to become full of light and much more accurate, much more objectively real, in the sense of this reality when we share things in this reality. So it seemed to actually become more accurate and more precise over time, and that's really continued. So I do think that, that has led me to feel that a lot of the early stuff can be more fantastical, and that's maybe when, like, even on other levels, it was more, I don't know, more like almost like a filmic idea of what the astral planes or something like that would be, or maybe more of an esoteric idea, because I guess I was reading all these astral projection books that talked in layers and planes and spheres and all these different ideas from the sort of more new age ideas that come from theosophy mainly. So you have a lot of these theosophical ideas that come in, and then are now really have been repackaged as the new age, really. And a lot of that didn't match with the experiences, or it was far too subjective. So when I looked at it again, I found that, hold on, that's not really a sort of objective experience. But over time, that sort of stuff seemed to dissolve, and things that I could verify and be objective about came in. Even on the other levels, like I mentioned, the plane crash experience, that was obviously on another level, but it was something that I was then able to also verify to some degree. So I think a lot like the Buddhist ideas or the meditational ideas, that maybe in some senses we're seeing things in a more illusory sense on one level at one stage. As we develop and as we learn to see things as they truly are, the illusions disappear. We start to literally see things as they are, and I think that's really what science is. The scientific method is an attempt to strip away your belief systems, your assumptions, your delusions, all of that stuff, and to just be clear and to just say what is really happening. And that's the beauty of the sort of scientific method, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for joining us today. Um, I know we're almost at the like 2 hours now, but time kind of just flies when you get into it, though. And
Well, it's good to not just cut things to an hour and etc. Anyway, I think because um, sometimes the hour only covers the sort of bare basics, and then I think in many ways when you start to go beyond that, you start to get the real insights and the really interesting stuff that you can't really cover in an hour.
yeah, that's true. And I was gonna ask you another question, but I don't know if you have time for another question or you.
Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to ask you about time, um, in the out of body state. Is it how much different do you experience time than in the physical?
It does depend on the experience. I've had a real variation over the years with that. The longest out of body experience I ever had was 12 hours.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and but it didn't feel like 12 hours. I only know it was 12 hours by the clock, but it actually felt more like, maybe an hour or two. Hard to say exactly, but it definitely didn't feel like 12 hours. So that's one example. Then recently, I had an out of body experience that was my longest recent experience in the last year, let's say, um, where I went to the over the Arctic Ocean, and I went over the Nordic seed bank that's up there, where they've got seeds from all over the world stored in a huge vault underground. I didn't
Wow.
even know that existed, interestingly, but I saw it from above in the out of body experience, and I was able to identify the island because I moved away from the island off to the east. And as I moved across to the east, I saw another island that resembled a boot, but in the reverse direction to Italy. So Italy sort of goes one way, this one was going the other way. And that suggested to me that I might be able to locate where this was. It was obviously the Arctic because it was all ice and snow, and I was obviously in the far north. So after the experience, I was able to locate that boot-shaped island, and then across from that was where this seed bank is. It's called something like Salvold. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly in Norwegian, but something like that. Um, and so across to the east was this boot island, and I moved down into the north of Finland, which is not far from where I live. So it's kind of I was sort of moving back towards where I was physically, and I saw a man who seemed to look into me. I don't know if he could actually see me, but it was almost like we had a connection. And he was a Sami man, which is the sort of native Finnish people who the kind of folk traditions, and they live with the reindeer. They're a very sort of traditional people. So he was in Sami costume. So that was a very profound experience I had quite recently. Um, and in that experience, it was 2 hours long, roughly, but it was 2 hours long in reality. So the time matched quite well. But then I've had other experiences where I've been out for a very short period of time, literally in physical time, but the experience seemed to last much longer. So it seems to be the full spectrum of distortion is possible within the experience, but most of my experiences do seem to match fairly closely with physical time.
Okay. Yeah, I've had I haven't really analyzed the time and at least my out of body experiences, but I know with dreams and with sleep, it feels like you're sleeping for hours and hour, like 10 hours, and then you wake up, you look at the clock, it's only been like 20 minutes. And so I know kind of what you mean by that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you too was, and William Buhlman talks about this as the shared experience.
Mm.
Have you had any shared experience where you've gone, met somebody, then you came back to your body and then talked about it with the other person?
I have. It's not a common experience, but at times I've had things like that with my partner, and actually had a very interesting experience recently where it was like the two of us were laying on our bed, and it was like well, both of us or one of us was projecting a humanoid form, like a basically like an energy body above us, and we could both physically see it. So it was like we were sharing this moment of sort of both projecting an energy form out from our bodies and perceiving it from underneath. And that stayed there for a long period of time, and we both saw it physically. So that was a very sort of related, interesting experience. I've also had experiences where people have seen me while they were physical and while I was in an out of body experience. People usually see other people in the form of a shadow, humanoid shadow form. That's
Okay.
the most common description. One of my students recently had a amazing experience where he met with his young son. I think he was 11-year-old boy, while he was having an out of body experience. So they both met while out of body, and it was the little boy's first ever out of body experience. And he met his father during the experience, and they both saw each other as shadows. So I've also had a few shared experiences with a close friend when I was at school as well. So a few intermittent experiences of sharing OBEs, but it's not the most common. More common for me has probably been sharing some kind of experience of energy or a sort of ghost type experience or things like that. As I mentioned, the sphere when I was younger that we both saw, and the torso, the figure that me and my partner projected or saw recently. So that was quite recently, only like a year or so ago, I think. So yeah, things like that.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's just interesting. You've grown up, at least I have grown up thinking, that, and I mentioned it too in the show that, it's not really supposed to talk about it, but I find it fascinating. And I could talk about this all day. But
I guess I was lucky that I didn't have any religious dogma or anything like that in my family. Both my parents are non-religious and weren't practicing any kind of religious belief or anything like that. So they didn't really have any judgment or anything like that towards what I was doing. They just and I was very open about it. I talked about it constantly, probably drove them mad talking about it. But I was very open about it all, and they were very ordinary, down to earth Londoners. Didn't really know what to make of the things I was describing, probably. And they're still interested and supportive, but it's not something they understand or are particularly drawn to. But yeah, they definitely don't have a negative or particularly positive attitude. They're like just neutral about it, really.
do you have siblings?
I have a brother.
Does he do this too, or is he kind of like your parents?
No, he's like my parents.
Okay.
He's I don't think we've ever even really talked about it very much. It's a subject that I think he tends to avoid. We sort of talk around it,
Okay.
but yeah, it's not something he's really drawn to either. So yeah, but he's never said anything negative about it or anything. He's just it's Graham's thing, I think, is how he
Yeah.
looks at it.
Yeah. That's kind of how I am with my immediate family. My extended family, there's I have a couple relatives that they won't even watch the films that I've done. I'm sure they don't even listen to this podcast, but it's, because they're just so wrapped up into, if it didn't come from the church, then it must be, bad, and you're gonna punish for eternity, kind of thing.
Oh,
But
okay.
but
Interestingly, I don't know if you've spoken to Evan Alexander or you're aware of his work.
oh yeah, yep,
But I did a dialogue with Evan Alexander when we were both talking at the conference in Las Vegas last year, and then as a kind of disconnected thing. But then again, he was on a Christian radio show that I was also invited to speak on, and we were debating a skeptic, interestingly, and during that debate, the whole sort of issue of, well, not really during the debate, but sort of after the debate, the whole issue of these kinds of experiences in Christianity came up, because the whole debate was mainly focused on science and the out-of-body experience and those kinds of things, but it didn't really get into the Christian perspective, which I think is a real strength of that show, because the guys who do it, to their credit, don't push the religion, and they're very open-minded, and they're willing to debate and to have the dialogue about their religion versus the science or versus other alternative viewpoints, etc. But the host, interestingly, sent me a lot of links afterwards saying that he actually felt that my viewpoint clearly was coming from a viewpoint consistent with Christ and positive sort of values in his understanding, and he sent me a lot of links that seemed to reference out of body experiences in the Bible. So that was quite interesting. That he was a Christian, but he didn't take the standard, oh, this is a bad thing angle. He saw it as you're experiencing your spirit directly, and why should there be anything wrong with that? And I agree. I don't see any reason why it would be anti any of the religions, really.
It's just good to see that, the host being, even though they're deeply rooted in religion, they still have a pretty good open mind about it. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the show. It was a great talk, and we want to, eventually have you back at some point.
Thank you. That would be great. And yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been really great. And I will let you know when I'm over in the US.
If you have a suggestion for our show, please contact us on our website at www.thepathseries.com. And please rate and review us in iTunes as well. You can also find our films at our website, as well as vimeo.com, guyamtv.com, amazon.com, and iTunes.